Hello, I am Zelros, and this is a retrospective review of Dark Souls 3. Before I begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about my introduction to Dark Souls and why I'm reviewing the third game in the series first. Prior to playing any of the other games, all I really knew about the series was one thing it's known for: its difficulty. So I was a bit apprehensive towards the game, but decided to give it a try anyway. At first, I only really expected to play the game every once in a while, and not really put much effort into it. So I started with the third game in the series. Despite having many links to the first game, it isn't required to know anything about the game in order to play 3, so I don't want to compare it to anything that came before. I want to look at 3 as its own game without any outside influence to hopefully give a unique perspective. So let us start the review with the story. The story of Dark Souls 3 follows our character, the Ashen One, an undead risen from the grave to link the flame and essentially save the world. In order to do this, we must travel the land of Lothric and defeat 4 Lords of Cinder in order to gain access to this flame. That's really about all the information we are given. We are told that this is what you're supposed to do, but never really told why. Everything is intentionally kept vague. My first time ever playing, I didn't really know much about what was going on, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The details of the story are there, but only if you want to look for them. Between character dialogue and item descriptions, the lore of the world can be found, and much of it is open to interpretation. This creates a sense of mystery around what is happening in Lothric, and helps to push me forward to maybe figuring out what is exactly happening in this world around you. One particular aspect of the story that I find especially interesting is that we are referred to as undead. In fact, everybody you meet is referred to as undead. Nobody is a human anymore. Everybody has died and come back to life, but not even in a negative way. Your character doesn't seem to have any issues walking around and conversing with people despite being resurrected not too long ago. However, this is never really talked about, and raises a lot of questions about what being undead really means. What power makes people undead? At the beginning of the game, a large bell ring awakens your character and many others to specifically light the flame. But what exactly does a bell do to cause undeath? And if everybody is technically undead, doesn't that just become the standard, and therefore that's just what human beings are now? So many questions can be asked about such a small part of the game. And that's what Dark Souls does best. It makes you question everything about what is going on, and only gives you pieces of information to stitch together the big picture yourself. The constant mystery and desire to find the answers to what's going on really helps build a sense of immersion in the world. Aldrich, one of the Lords of Cinder, is a great example of this. In a conversation with Hawkwood the Deserter, he reveals that Aldrich was once a well-respected cleric. However, he began to feast on people to the point his body swelled and turned into sludge. Hawkwood says that he was to link the flame and become a Lord of Cinder, not by virtue, but by might. Aldrich was powerful, and for that reason alone, was chosen for the exact same task that we are on now. This can certainly raise some questions about what linking the flame really means, and if it even is the right choice. I can go on for a long time about all the interesting bits of story in Dark Souls 3, but you don't actually need to see any of it. Not a single bit of story is required to be understood to play through the game, so I won't go on for too long about it. I mainly play games for their story, and it's a very important part of the experience for me, but I do think it's interesting how Dark Souls 3 can separate its story and gameplay so well. Why things are happening isn't necessarily important, but the incredibly dangerous enemies trying to kill you at all times certainly is. So let's talk about the combat and mechanics of Dark Souls 3. There is a crazy amount of customization that can be put into your character. At the start of the game, you can choose a class, which really just determines your starting stats. At the end of the day, you can customize your character to do anything you like. From a warrior in heavy armor, to a mage spellcaster, and everything in between, you have the freedom to play the game how you like. You can mix and match your gear as much as you like, with your weapons having the biggest impact on your playstyle. Each weapon type has its own attack animation, all with their pros and cons. It's a lot of fun to experiment with combinations of gear and weapons to find what fits you most, and extremely rewarding to defeat enemies once you master them. And this is where I'd like to discuss the difficulty of the game, or rather the stipulation that the game is difficult. Just like I mentioned at the beginning, prior to playing the game, all I had heard about it was the difficulty. It can be a bit daunting to pick up the game for the first time when the most popular thing you hear about it is that it's hard. However, that's not entirely true. Dark Souls 3 is not a difficult game. It's a fair game. Extremely fair. Essentially, every aspect of the game is a delicate balancing act of pros and cons. It actively rewards you for playing well, and punishes you when you make mistakes. One important aspect of combat is your 3 resource bars of health, mana, and stamina. Stamina is used to perform actions like attacking, dodging, or sprinting. Mana is used for spell casting, while health is health. Stamina is the only one of these 3 that regenerates. Health and mana are essentially only gained through your Estus and Ashen flasks, which have a limited number of flask charges. It's obviously essential to manage your resources to perform well, but it's that delicate balancing act that makes it so unique. Poor stamina management will likely cause you to take damage, which consumes life, which will be replenished by your Estus flask. Eventually, you will run out of charges and chances, and end up losing. However, the less mistakes made, the less resources are committed, and you can stay in the fight longer. And mistakes are exactly that. Mistakes. In Dark Souls 3, it's very easy to tell when you made a mistake. That's because the game is so rewarding when you do the right thing, that it's often easy to tell exactly when you made the mistake and how you can fix it for next time. Very rarely does it feel like the game is against you. The game is incredibly rewarding to play, in part because of this balancing act. You feel exceptionally accomplished when you defeat a challenge for the first time. Learning attack patterns, understanding the environment, and using any advantage you can leads to a victory that was earned, not given. That leads me into what I like to call the secret of Dark Souls. The game can be quite difficult for somebody who picks it up for the first time. There is a secret to the combat that I think is quite genius game design. In most games, when an enemy attacks, that's your cue to block or dodge. Therein lies the problem I feel most people have when playing Dark Souls. Once you figure out this secret, suddenly the possibilities open up and you feel like you have a fighting chance against almost any enemy. The combat of Dark Souls 3 goes against this conventional design. Instead of showing the player when to dodge, it shows the player where. Just like with the resources, the system is designed to reward good play and punish mistakes. Dodge rolling isn't a granted way to ignore damage, and if done in the wrong direction, you will be punished. However, if dodging in the right direction, you can never have to take damage and conserve all of your resources. This causes an illusion of difficulty, but really creates an extremely rewarding style of gameplay that continues even on repeat playthroughs. While the enemies stay the same, all of the customization into your character wildly varies the gameplay. Different stats, gear, and weapons will cause you to approach enemies in completely different ways, all while still needing to manage the same resources. With all this in mind, let's talk about the enemies of Dark Souls 3, specifically the bosses. There are 26 bosses in the entire game, including DLC, all with their own unique mechanics that challenge you in a variety of different ways. The very first you'll encounter is the tutorial boss, Udix Gundyr. I have to say, I think the tutorial for Dark Souls 3 is absolutely amazing. Right away, you're given messages on the ground explaining your controls. And that's it. This sets the tone for the rest of the game. It will not hold your hand, even in a tutorial. Gundyr is a great boss to introduce new players into the game. His attacks aren't too hard to dodge, once you get the hang of things, and he even has a second phase where he becomes half of a giant sludge dragon monster. But for a first-time player, it can be a sudden shock, causing a bit of panic. It gets the player into the idea that fights aren't 100% static. Things change. There are multiple phases, and new attacks to deal with. It's a fantastic way to start, and really my favorite tutorial of any game. One of my favorite fights is with the Abyss Watchers. They are one of the Lords of Cinder that must be defeated, and the fight with them is very memorable. When you enter the room, you find that all but 2 have been killed, and they're actually fighting each other. You see one defeated, and the other turns his gaze to you. Now the boss is very agile, performing fast acrobatic attacks. Seems like a standard sword fight at first, until a second Abyss Watcher rises from the dead to come after you. The second guy isn't a full boss, but he can still cause a new person to panic at suddenly having a new enemy when they thought it was a traditional one-on-one. Both have the same moveset and can be a bit difficult to hit the real boss between their fast attacks. Then, while you're preoccupied trying to stay alive, a third Watcher rises up. Is this a joke? Do they endlessly spawn more bosses until I win? Well, yes. Except the third Watcher is actually on your side. Just like the cutscene at the beginning, they fight each other too. Suddenly this difficult 1v2 situation turns into a 2v2, and feels much more fair and balanced. You now have the chance to really fight back while they are distracted fighting your friendly watcher. Once defeated, you enter a second phase, where all of the fire of the nearby defeated Abyss Watchers enters a single body, where it becomes that one-on-one sword fight like you expected at the beginning. Except, he is on fire. All of those quick, agile attacks now have a flame element to them, meaning you can't dodge the way you normally would, or else you get caught by the fire. You have to constantly change your strategy through the fight and need to take advantage of any moment you can. It really is a memorable fight. If you decide to look into the lore a little bit, the fight becomes even more interesting and memorable. The Abyss Watchers defended against the Abyss, which, to my knowledge, is some sort of corruption. The Watchers would destroy entire nations at the slightest sign of this corruption, which is apparently what they did to a place known as Carthus. After defeating the boss, we explore the catacombs of Carthus, and the skeletal remnants of the society. The Abyss Watchers, in an effort to protect, causes a lot of destruction. Just like Aldrich, they aren't necessarily a noble group of people, and their might causes them to collectively link the fire. However, at the end of the day, even they got corrupted to madness, and endlessly fight each other until we put them down. A single fight has such a large amount of backstory that you never even need to find. Another memorable fight is of course the Soul of Cinder, the final boss. After defeating the 4 Lords of Cinder, we can go to the Kiln of the First Flame and fight the Soul of Cinder, a collection of everybody who has ever linked the flame before. Thematically, it's an incredible way to finish the game, essentially a fight with your ancestors. And he has access to their knowledge and skills, making it feel like a real fight against all of those that came before you. Upon starting the fight, the Soul has access to multiple different forms he can constantly cycle through. These forms are different builds that players could actually use themselves. One is a heavy strength build with a lance, another is an agile dexterity build with a scimitar, and even a spellcaster build. This creates a varied experience right off the bat, with each time we fight the Soul potentially being a bit different than the last. He might use a build more often, or switch between his builds more often. Each build challenges you in very different ways. The dexterity build gives him a poison cloud attack, and he often tries to follow up with quick attacks to keep you in the cloud. He even backflips out of danger when being attacked himself. The strength build gives him slower but very powerful attacks with extended range due to wielding a lance, while the spellcaster build gives him a very large area of effect attacks. Every time he switches builds, you're going to be challenged in completely different ways, constantly keeping you on your toes. The spellcaster build is what I find most difficult to fight. He often creates magic orbs around his body that eventually shoot at you, but these orbs continue to generate for a short time even after he switches builds. It often messes me up quite a bit. But once you get past all this and defeat him, you enter a second phase where he no longer switches builds and takes on a single one. This build is influenced by the last boss of the first game, but since I played this game first, I didn't have any knowledge of this at the time. The Soul wields a flaming coiled sword and gains a bunch of combo attacks. One such combo is a 5-hit combo attack that throws you into the air and slams you into the ground into a burst of flames. This can easily kill you if you aren't prepared for it, as his combos can hit very hard. The fight can require a large amount of concentration to look for the cues for when he's going to start these combos. However, once you finally manage to defeat him, it is beyond rewarding. The sense of accomplishment for learning attack patterns and combos of enemies is at its peak after coming out on top of the Soul of Cinder. Just like most bosses in the game, you will certainly remember your first time beating the Soul of Cinder by yourself. Not all of the bosses are perfect by any means. The Soul-Rotted Greatwood is one such boss. The boss is essentially a giant tree, except you can only damage him by hitting small specific bubbles on its body. Any other part of its body takes no damage, so you have to run around finding these bubbles, and they don't regenerate, so you'll be running in circles the entire time. It also has a second phase. Sort of. When you pop the big bubble on its crotch, it breaks the ground, putting both of you into a cavern where you continue the fight. The difference is now it grows an extra hand that tries to smack you around. The entire fight is just running in circles, poking a bubble here and there until it dies. It often repeats the same moves multiple times, meaning you end up standing on the other side of the arena, just watching the boss spaz out a bunch. It's quite a dull encounter, Unfortunately, it drops a kiln that lets you convert boss souls into special weapons, so you kind of have to defeat it if you want any of them. Another poor excuse of a boss is the Ancient Wyvern. He is classified as a boss, but is anything but. The boss fight consists of a gauntlet of normal enemies as you run around a path to eventually fall on the Wyvern's head and one-shot him. Most of the normal enemies can just be ignored, and you can just run past all of them. It's pretty pathetic, and I don't know how it's considered a boss fight at all. What's worse is that the Wyvern is followed up by the Nameless King, which is arguably one of the hardest boss fights in the entire game. How do you follow up one of the most pathetic excuses of a boss with one of the hardest? Speaking of the Nameless King, I'm not a huge fan of him. I know that isn't the most popular opinion, but I just don't enjoy the fight. I'm not saying the fight is bad either, there's nothing wrong with the fight, I simply don't care for it myself. What I do like is the mysterious story behind him. He apparently betrayed his people and allied himself with dragons. It's said they wiped his name from all records of history so that nobody would remember him. Makes the Nameless King a very fitting title for him. You can talk about each boss in Dark Souls for hours. It's one of the magical aspects of the game that grips my attention. But I will end this segment with Yorm the Giant. Now this fight seems epic at first. A battle with a giant who is a Lord of Cinder. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a gimmick fight. In the back of the boss arena, there's a sword called Stormbreaker, which you use to defeat Yorm. You can fight him normally, but he has an absurd amount of life, so Stormbreaker is really the way to go. The sad part is, the sword's special attack consumes your entire stamina bar to deal 1/4 of Yorm's life. So this literal giant is felled by 4 swipes of a sword. It would be forgivable if it was a difficult special attack to get off, but his abilities are incredibly easy to dodge, and he goes down without a problem. I'd like to compare Yorm to the fight with Lothric and Lorien. Now Lothric is a Lord of Cinder, and Lorien is his brother. The fight starts just against Lorien, but Lothric joins in phase 2. Lorien is crippled, appearing to have lost the use of his legs for the most part, so he crawls around the battlefield. However, Lothric is a spellcaster, and gives his brother the ability to teleport. Now Lorien doesn't need legs. He can be anywhere in the room at a moment's notice. His heavy sword swings suddenly become extremely deadly, because it's difficult to predict his movements. Once defeated, Lothric crawls on his back, adding spellcast to Lorien's physical assaults. Now how did a literal giant become less intimidating than a cripple? Yorm's attacks are easily dodged, and your weapon 4-shots him. Lorien, on the other hand, despite not having the use of his legs, teleports directly to you with aggressive heavy-hitting attacks. It's often unpredictable when he's going to teleport, and it's impossible to tell where. Even without Lothric, Lorien is far more engaging of a boss fight and far more intimidating. I find it quite sad that despite Yorm's potential, he drops the ball real bad. Before moving on to the DLCs, I'd like to discuss the areas of Dark Souls 3. The visuals are absolutely breathtaking, and I often find myself just staring into the distance at the beautiful artwork that is the zones you are in. Irithyll of the Boreal Valley is easily the most gorgeous area in the entire game. Upon seeing it for the first time, right after the Catacombs of Karthus, I always just stop and stare out at the beautiful scenery. If it wasn't for the constant stream of monsters trying to kill you at every turn, it would actually be an eerily peaceful place to walk through. My favorite zone, though, is easily the Untended Graves. This is an optional area behind Lothric Castle, but that's the thing about the zone. It doesn't fit. The Untended Graves is actually the Cemetery of Ash, the starting area. However, the entire area has no light. It's all pitch black. You can only see just a little bit in front of you, and the entire area has a spooky vibe to it. What is this place? How is it here when the cemetery still exists? Since there's no light anywhere, is this supposed to be a what-if scenario if the fire fades and we fail our mission? We find an uncorrupted Gundyr here, so this could be the past? This area brings up so many questions. It's really interesting. We even find a dark version of Firelink Shrine, our one safe haven in our journey. It looks identical to our shrine, but seems long abandoned with only the hand-laden vendor still there. The grave stands out against all other zones in the game, and I love it for that. This brings us to the first DLC. The Ashes of Ariandel. We first find a man praying at an altar in the Cathedral of the Deep, and he teleports us to the painted world of Ariandel. We find this place to be a snowy, mountainous landscape that is slowly rotting away. The DLC overall isn't terribly long, but plenty to explore in its smaller environment. We find this rot to be affecting the inhabitants of this painted world, and they long for freedom. It's apparently tradition to burn a painted world once it begins to rot. However, Ariandel, the painting's creator, has decided against this. So we must traverse this snowy, rotting landscape to unlock Ariandel's chambers. Aesthetically, the land is beautiful and peaceful, reminding me a lot of Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. But the rot that is afflicting this land leads us to some dangerous enemies and a difficult journey through the hills. Eventually, we can confront Ariandel, and we find that a woman by the name of Sister Frida has actually convinced him to let the painting rot. Frida at first seems like a caretaker of sorts of his church. However, we discover she's actually an Ashen One like we are. Frida renounced the flame and traveled to Ariandel to find a home. When the time came to purge the rot, similarly to how we linked the fire, she convinced Ariandel to get rid of the fire instead. So comes a very interesting boss fight. Frida is one of 2 bosses in the entire game with not 2, but 3 phases. The first phase is a basic fight with some interesting frost-based attacks. Periodically, Frida becomes invisible, which she can be a little annoying with. But once defeated, Ariandel becomes enraged, lighting the room on fire and resurrecting Frida. This phase isn't anything too special. Frida tries to heal them both, while Ariandel bum rushes you from time to time. The third phase is the tough part, where the combined energy gives Frida a black flame. This fight is incredibly tough and unforgiving, especially in Phase 3. I enjoy the thematic elements of the boss fight, but despite the challenge, I don't feel like the fight stands out very much compared to some of the other fights in the main game. Fights like the Soul of Cinder are far more memorable to me, but this fight can still be a lot of fun. There is an optional boss, the Champion Gravetender and the Gravetender's Wolf. This fight is only really to unlock an option to search for PvP battles, so I personally don't bother. Speaking of PvP battles, I've been waiting to talk about the PvP aspects of the game until now. The entire game can be played solo in offline mode. This is how I played through most of the game. If online, you can play co-op with other players, and it is honestly a ton of fun. While it's rewarding to beat the challenges of the game by yourself, it's enjoyable to experience that with other players. However, if co-op is enabled, so is PvP. In order to have access to anything player-related, you must be embered, which happens after any boss fight or when consuming an ember. Apart from the player aspect, it gives a bonus to health as well. I, personally, cannot stand the PvP in Dark Souls 3. I choose to play offline because I would rather play solo than co-op and also deal with the PvP at the same time. The way PvP works is once embered, you can summon people to your world, but can also be invaded by opposing players as well. There are some NPC invasions that simulate this experience. But, in my experience, the PvP is hindered greatly by server stability. If you aren't caught by a twinked character, I found it's very common for the game itself to mess you up. The lag creates an environment where things aren't equal for both players. One person can hit somebody when they shouldn't because of that disparity, and it can ruin an otherwise good run through an area. The other aspect of PvP I don't like is how it goes against the very core of what the game is about, fairness. In order to be invaded, you need to be embered, so logically, if you don't ember up, you can't be invaded, right? The problem with that is beating any boss rewards you with a free ember power-up. So what is meant to help you in the next area and reward for defeating the boss, instead becomes a hindrance, as you enter a brand new area and immediately get invaded without warning. The area immediately following the boss Pontiff Sulyvahn is the best example of this. This area is a big PvP area with a large amount of invasions. However, on a first playthrough, there is no way of knowing about this high traffic of players. So this area becomes purely problematic as you are simply trying to make your way through. That's why I play offline instead. Of course, there's nothing wrong with enjoying the PvP in Dark Souls, but I'd rather just stay away from it myself. This brings us to the final DLC, the Ringed City. This DLC seems to take place in the same general area as the Kiln of the First Flame, The world seems to be breaking apart and covered in ash. Our goal here is a bit vague at first, with us more or less just traversing this strange environment and trying to survive. Other than the atmosphere and world, I don't have a whole lot to say about this first area. It's interesting to think what might be happening to the world and why does this seem to be separate from the world we initially traversed throughout the game. Otherwise, there just isn't much going on. After getting through this place, we are brought to this ring city itself, which has far more going on. The city is absolutely gorgeous, with beautiful visuals. You traverse multiple environments from a cityscape, to a swamp, to mountains. They fit a lot into a single zone. After making our way to the very top, we find a sleeping Filianor, this mysterious woman that the denizens seem to worship. So obviously we wake her up, because reasons. That's when the entire city disappears, and we are brought back to a world that is basically destroyed. Here we find Slave Knight Gale, the same knight who teleported us to the painted world of Ariandel, and fight him over the power of the Dark Soul itself. So again, aesthetically, I love the areas of the Ring City DLC. It has a wide variety of environments to traverse all inside the city, with a lot more exploration than Ariandel. However, the thing holding it back for me are the boss fights. There are 4 boss fights in total in the DLC, 3 of which that I do not like. The first boss fight is against the Demon Princes. There are 2 phases to this fight, the first of which I feel is excellently designed. The 2 princes have different attack styles, one with aggressive physical assaults, while the other is more of a specialist, casting delayed spells from farther away. What I really like about this phase is that the princes can swap powers between each other. Their powers complement each other's and can suddenly switch, forcing you to change up your plan of attack. Phase 2 is where I dislike this fight. Upon beating both, the one to die second bursts into flames, and becomes essentially a brand new boss. Now, I generally dislike this phase because of what started out as an extremely balanced fight becomes a clusterfuck. This new boss starts to fly, creating massive and powerful attacks depending on which one of the princes was resurrected. The one I fought created massive orbs of fire that are essentially homing missiles. If hit, these orbs can borderline one-shot you, and I find are difficult to avoid. Making matters worse, the boss tends to follow us up with a flyby attack that is difficult to see since you are running away from the orbs. It becomes more aggravating to fight than rewarding, like most bosses. The second boss we fight is probably the weirdest fight in Dark Souls 3. There are 2 potential boss fights in the Church of Filianor. If in online mode, you fight a champion of the church, which is a random player. Essentially, the boss is a super invasion PvP battle. Now, I would give this fight a pass if it was optional. Similar to the Gravetender in Ariandel, you could simply opt out of PvP if it wasn't interesting to you, but this fight is required. You have to beat it to progress. I find it baffling that a PvP battle is required to progress through a PvE area. Server stability alone could cause enough issues, but randomly getting a twink character is just dumb. So your other option is to fight the game in offline mode, which just gives you a superpowered PvE invasion instead. It could have easily been a nice side thing to do with other players, but instead, it's a hindrance to progressing the game. After defeating the church boss fight, you immediately get put next to the fight with Slave Knight Gale. Now, Gale is an excellent boss fight that is extremely challenging, but extremely rewarding at the same time. I put him on the same level as the Soul of Cinder. He is the other boss in the game with 3 phases, each piling on more mechanics than the last. In Phase 2 and 3, his cape adds an extra element attack, similar to fire, that makes it a bit tougher to dodge correctly. He is very weak to poison, which is the strategy I took when challenging Gale. The only real complaint that I have is the lightning. He eventually causes lightning strikes, which are entirely random. With how difficult the boss is naturally, he certainly doesn't need a mechanic around randomness. Gale is the only fight I enjoy in the DLC. The last fight available is an optional fight, and is Midir. You can see Midir earlier in the DLC, but get to challenge him around when you get to the church. I am glad he is optional, because I refuse to even bother with him at this point. Since I choose to opt out of fighting with him, I will just leave it more as a personal take and won't go into too much detail. So I only really enjoy one of the 4 boss fights in the DLC. I don't really find the DLC overall to be that great. I find some of the aspects in the zones interesting, but the main challenges are the boss fights. Between the main game and the DLC, the music is absolutely amazing. Music is only played during a boss fight, which gives an interesting feeling to normal zones. Now for me, this creates a feeling of danger. Anything can be around the next corner, and you need to constantly be aware of your surroundings. Especially playing offline, it also solidifies the feeling of isolation since you are truly on your own traversing the land. It also makes the boss fight feel more intense. Walking into a room to hear the music start instantly lets you know that this is going to be a challenge. Overall, I find Dark Souls 3 to be an extremely rewarding and enjoyable experience. All of the areas are gorgeous, and the game will constantly test your skill at every possible chance. If you want to, the lore and story are interesting to look for and figure out. Even though I don't enjoy the DLCs as much as the main game, I highly recommend the game to people, even if you are like me and haven't played the previous titles. Dark Souls 3 is a great starting point into the franchise. Now I wanted to mention a couple things that aren't in my review. There are a few topics I intentionally left out because of their direct comparison to Dark Souls 1. Bonfire placement, fast travel, and linearity are some of the topics that are often discussed with 3, but rely on how Dark Souls 1 is played. But, like I said at the beginning, I didn't play 1 when I started 3, so I wanted to keep it out of the review. I will go into these discussions at length when I cover the first game, so that there is much more context. I also hope it will give a unique perspective since I experienced things a little backwards. But, that's it for this retrospective review of Dark Souls 3. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.